Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The world wasn't too ready for this. Hell, how could anyone be? When the virus first appeared in the remote mountains of Southeast Asia, the global community barely blinked. Another strange illness, some thought, perhaps a new flu variant or an odd mutation of some tropical fever. The media paid little attention. A few scientists raised alarm bells, but no one took them seriously until the first outbreak happened in Bangkok. It started in the slums among people who had little to lose and even less hope. At first, the symptoms seemed manageable: fever, fatigue, mild hallucination. Nothing the human race had interesting before, but then the second wave hit. The infected began to change, not just physically but mentally. Ordinary men and women gained extraordinary strength, speed, and resilience. But along with that came something far worse: a violent, insatiable rage. It wasn't tea long before Bangkok became a battleground. That's where Tony first heard about it, through grim reports from a colleague who worked at the CDC. Tony had been buried in his lab for weeks, working on a new antiviral for something else entirely, when his phone buzzed with a message that made his blood run cold. New virus spreading fast. Beyond anything we've ever seen, people are changing. Get out now. Tony reread the message 3 times, as if the words themselves would reshape into something less ominous. But they didn't. He'd been living in Bangkok for months, consulting with local authorities on a separate public health crisis. Now that seemed like a trivial concern compared to what was happening just miles away. Outside his apartment, sirens screamed through the humid night air. From his window, he could see plumes of smoke rising in the distance, backlit by the fires of a city descending into chaos. He grabbed his emergency kit, something he'd depacked out of paranoia, and bolted from the apartment, heading for the one place he knew would have the answers: the biogen facility on the outskirts of the city. It was there, amidst the panic of scientists and military personnel trying to lock down the outbreak, that Tony came face to face with Clark. Clark had been in Bangkok for 3 days before the shit hit the fan. He wasn't there on a vacation or even on official duty. No, this was personal. Clark was a field operative, a former soldier who specialized in handling the unthinkable, the classified, and the danger. When the first whispers of a strange illness hit the international intelligence networks, his superiors sent him in to gather intel. But by the time he arrived, it was too late to contain anything. The streets were a war zone. He met Tony in the middle of that chaos, when the military had sealed off the lab and the infected began to breach the outer perimeter. Tony, drenched in sweat and carrying nothing but a backpack filled with hastily grabbed equipment, pushed his way past the soldiers guarding the lab door. Clark spotted him immediately, something about the way he moved, the determination etched into his face. This wasn't some panicked civilian. This guy had a plan. Clark approached him, cutting through the mess of people screaming orders into radios, rushing to secure data, and generally losing their mind. "You the scientist?" Clark asked, his voice calm despite the tension coiling in the air. Tony glanced up at him, confused for a second, before nodding. "Yeah, I am Tony." "Good, you were coming with me." "Wait, what?" "I am trying to find—" "No time for that. You want to get answers here. Not now. Place is compromised. But I need to." Clark's hand clamped down on Tony's sapphire, pulling him toward the exit. "You'll be dead if you stay here. Trust me." Tony hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with calculation. Could he really leave? But then the explosion rocked the building, sending chunks of concrete and steel crashing down. The infected had broken through. That was all the convincing Tony needed. Together, they ran. The 2 men barely escaped as the lab collapsed into ruin, swarmed by ravagers, the name given to the infected, whose violent, erratic behavior made them seem more like wild animals than human. Clark led Tony through the narrow alleyways and streets, avoiding the main roads where military blockades were crumbling under the sheer force of the outbreak. They eventually found refuge in an abandoned high-rise building, far enough from the city center to catch their breath. Tony sank against the wall, panting. What the hell was that? "Welcome to the New World Order," Clark muttered, peering through the cracked window at the chaos unfolding below. "You want to tell me what's really going on? Because what I've seen in the last 12 hours doesn't line up with any virus we've ever dealt with." Tony wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart still racing. "It's not just a virus," he said, grimacing. "It's something more. We thought it was just another outbreak at first. But the way people are changing, the way their bodies are adapting, it's almost like genetic modification. The infected are gaining abilities, physical enhancements, That should be impossible. And the rage, the violence. Side effect, Tony muttered, staring at the floor. The human mind isn't equipped to handle such rapid changes. It drives them insane. Clark cursed under his breath. How does this happen? Someone made this. Did Tad? Tony nodded slowly. That's what I've been trying to figure out. I didn't know it was this bad, but I've been tracking the virus progression for weeks. It originated from a lab Biogen, the facility we were just at. Biogen Clark repeated piecing it together, so this isn't too natural. Someone engineered it. Not just anyone, Tony added there. A group behind it, the Ascendant. They believe the next stage of human evolution is genetic enhancement. They've been working on this for years, but something went wrong. The virus wasn't supposed to spread this way. Wrong or not, it stands tearing the world apart. Clark looked grim. So what? Some plan? You got a cure? I am working on it, Tony said, frustration evident in his voice. But it's evolving too fast every time. I think I've made a breakthrough. The virus changes. We're running out of time. Clark exhaled sharply, pushing himself away from the window. Then we need to find the source if we can to stop the virus from spreading. None of this mattered. Tony nodded in agreement, though he felt a heavy weight in his chest. Finding the source meant more than just tracking down a virus. It meant confronting the people who created it, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Their journey out of Bangkok was a blur of tense moments, close calls with the infected, and navigating through streets overrun with chaos. Clark's skills as a former soldier were put to the test, guiding them through danger zones while Tony tried to keep up, his mind racing with calculations and scenarios on how to stop this global catastrophe. As they moved further from the city, the devastation became less apparent, but the fear remained palpable. Refugee camps dotted the outskirts with survivors huddled together, waiting for aid that may never come. In the distance, helicopters roared overhead, carrying out extraction missions for high-value targets, while the rest of the population was left to fend for themselves. At one of the camps, they met a doctor named Sarah who had been working tirelessly to treat the infected. She had seen firsthand how the virus transformed people, how it broke them down mentally while building them up physically. They were like gods with the minds of demons, she said, describing the ravagers she'd encountered. Sarah had been gathering data on the virus from the survivors she'd treated. Some of the infected hadn't fully turned yet. Their abilities were emerging, but they hadn't succumbed to the madness. This gave Tony hope. If they could find a way to stabilize the virus in those individuals, it might lead to a cure. We need your help, Tony said, after explaining their mission. You've seen more of this up close than anyone else. If we can figure out what's causing the madness, we can stop it. Sarah hesitated, glancing around at the makeshift hospital she'd built. I can just leave these people. You don't have to, Clark said. We just need access to your data. We'll do the rest. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed, handing over her files and vowing to stay in contact if she discovered anything new. Tony downloaded everything onto his tablet, feeling a glimmer of hope as they prepared to move on. But the hope was short-lived. As they left the camp, a convoy of military trucks rolled in, their insignia unfamiliar. Clark's eyes narrowed. That sentient good. What is it? Tony asked, noticing the tension in Clark's posture. That's not local military. Those are Ascendant forces. Clark's instincts kicked in the moment he saw the convoy, and he immediately pulled Tony to the side, out of sight. With an eerie precision, the kind that only came with military discipline, an intent. These weren't standard soldiers. They moved like professionals, ruthless, efficient, and deadly. Ascendants, Clark muttered under his breath. They're here to clean up. Clean up. Tony whispered, his mind racing to keep up. True, but why would they? They don't leave witnesses. We need to move. Clark's voice was steady, but there was a cold urgency in his eyes that made Tony's stomach drop. They had stumbled into something far worse than a viral outbreak. The Ascendants weren't just responsible for creating the virus. They were actively ensuring no one found out. That meant Sarah and everyone else in the camp were in danger. Without hesitation, Clark led Tony through the back of the makeshift medical tents, keeping low and out of sight. The sound of boots hitting the ground, doors slamming shut, and orders being barked in crisp, foreign tones echoed through the air. Clark knew they had minutes, maybe seconds, before the camp was locked down. We can't just leave, Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. We don't have a choice. You want to help her. We take these bastards down, but we can't do that from here. Clark's words were harsh, but Tony knew they were true. As much as it pained him to leave Sarah and the others behind, staying would be suicide. He gritted his teeth and nodded. Together, they slipped into the shadows, making their way toward the outskirts of the camp. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them just as they reached the edge of the wood. Tony flinched at the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He could only imagine what was happening back there, innocent people caught in the crossfire of something far bigger than that. Clark pushed them forward, his face a mask of determination. "We need to find a way to cut their communications if they can. To you report back. We will have a shot at stopping them." They moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the camp fading behind them. Clark's military experience guided them, and soon they stumbled upon a small, camouflaged Ascendant outpost. It was tucked away in a clearing, almost invisible to the naked eye. Tony's mind raced, analyzing the situation while Clark scoped the perimeter. "We hit them hard fast, no mistakes." Clark whispered, his eyes locked on Tony. "Sutter, can you handle that?" Tony nodded, though his stomach churned with nerves. He wasn't a soldier. He'd spent most of his life in labs, not battlefields. But he knew that if they failed here, the Ascendants would continue their operation unchecked. The fate of humanity depended on stopping them. Clark handed Tony a small pistol. The plan was simple but dangerous. Clark would take out the guards patrolling the perimeter while Tony disabled the communications array inside the outpost. With no way to contact their superiors, the Ascendants wouldn't be able to call for reinforcements. It was risky, but it was their only option. Clark moved first, slipping through the trees like a shadow. He took down the first guard with a swift, silent strike, his knife flashing in the dim light. Tony followed behind, his hands trembling as he clutched the pistol. His mind was racing, going over the technical specs of the communication equipment he'd seen in the Ascendant's file. If he could just get to the central hub, he could disable it. As they neared the outpost, Tony felt his heart hammering in his chest. Every step felt like it could be his last, but Clark moved with an ease that was almost unnerving. Within minutes they had reached the control room. The door was unguarded, but Tony knew better than to relax. The real challenge was inside. Tony knelt by the door, listening for movement. The room beyond was quiet, too quiet. He glanced at Clark, who gave him a sharp nod. Taking a deep breath, Tony pushed the door open, the hinges creaking slightly in the silence. The room was empty, save for the humming computers lining the wall. "This is it," Tony whispered, rushing to the main console. His fingers danced across the keyboard as he hacked into the system. The firewall was advanced, but he was faster within seconds. He had access to the communication network. Clark stood guard at the door, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. "Stay hurry." "I am trying," Tony muttered, his focus entirely on the screen. The network was extensive, but he found what he was looking for, the central hub that controlled all outgoing transmissions. With a few keystrokes, he disabled it. "Done," Tony said, stepping back from the console feed. "They re-cut off." "Good." Clark turned to leave, but then froze. A faint noise caught Tony's attention too, a low, beeping sound coming from the console. "What is that?" His voice tensed. Clark's eyes widened in realization. "Planets at the fail, safe, they know, we re-near. Before either of them could react, the room exploded into chaos. The walls shook as the building's automated defense system activated, metal shutters slamming down over the windows and doors. Red lights flashed, and a voice over the intercom droned in a language Tony couldn't understand. "They were going to burn this place down with us in it," Clark said grimly, pulling Tony toward the far corner of the room. "Here we need to move." The door they had entered through was now sealed shut, but Clark wasn't one to give up easily. He scanned the room, searching for an exit. "At their share," he said, pointing to an air vent high on the wall. "Terrace platis, our only way out." Tony didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby chair and dragged it over, climbing up to reach the vent. Clark followed, using his knife to pry the metal grate loose. It took longer than either of them liked, but finally, the vent came free, and they crawled inside just as the room erupted in flame. The heat was intense, the smoke choking, but they kept moving. The vent was narrow, barely wide enough to fit through, but they had no choice. Behind them, the fire raged, consuming everything in its path. By the time they emerged from the vent, both men were covered in soot and sweat. They collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for air, but the relief was short-lived. The Ascendants were waiting for them. Clark reacted first, his instincts sharp. He rolled to his feet, pulling his gun as the first Ascendant soldier charged toward them. The sound of gunfire rang through the air, but Clark didn't flinch. He was a soldier, and this was his battlefield. Tony, on the other hand, froze. He wasn't built for this. But when one of the soldiers turned toward him, his eyes wild with the virus, scent influence, Tony knew he had no choice. He raised the pistol Clark had given him, his hands shaking, and fired. The soldier crumpled to the ground, and Tony stood there, stunned. He'd have never killed anyone before. The weight of it hit him all at once, but there was no time to dwell on it. More soldiers were coming. Clark grabbed Tony's arm, pulling him away from the scene. We have to keep moving. They ran through the forest, the sounds of pursuit close behind them. Clark led the way, his military training kicking in as he navigated the terrain. Tony followed, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. They had cut off the Ascendancy's communications, but at what cost? How many more were out there? And would they ever be able to stop this virus before it consumed everything? As they reached the edge of the forest, Clark slowed, glancing back. We bought ourselves some time, but not much. We need to get to a secure location and figure out our next move. Tony nodded, though his thoughts were still scattered. The weight of what they were up against was crushing, but there was no turning back now. They had to stop the Ascendants, no matter the cost. Clark led them toward a hidden safe house he'd set up earlier in the mission, deep in the mountain. It was a small, nondescript cabin, easily overlooked by anyone who didn't know where to look. As they approached, Clark slowed, his senses on high alert. He signaled for Tony to wait while he scouted the perimeter. After a tense few minutes, Clark returned, nodding for all intact. So, clear. Let's move. They entered the cabin, and Tony immediately went to work, setting up his equipment. He needed to analyze the data they gathered from the camp and Sarah's file. There had to be something there, a clue, a weakness in the virus that he could exploit. As Tony worked, Clark stood watch, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon. They were running out of time, and the Ascendants were relentless. But Clark had faith in Tony. If anyone could find a cure, it was him. Hours passed in tense silence, the only sound, the clicking of Tony's keyboard and the occasional rustle of wind outside. Finally, Tony looked up, his face pale but determined. I think I've had it. Clark turned, his expression unreadable. You've found a cure. Tony shook his head. Not exactly, but I've found the source. I know where the virus came from. Clark's eyes narrowed. Tony hesitated, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. Terrahead wasn't he just biogen? Some density just create the virus, they were using it. And the heart of their operation is in a place we never expected. Clark leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Tony met his gaze, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Washington,